Good afternoon, thanks for coming. My name is Cejnar, and I want to share with you some unique and probably, we believe, first in the world data on actually deep learning analytics of classroom computer use in Australia. My background is in STEM. I'm originally a cardiologist and a medical device technology CEO, and I became first interested in computer learning when my two daughters started using their laptop in classroom, and I am very evidence-based because medicine is very evidence-based, and so I've transferred some of my skills and interests into this area and started looking at the data and the evidence behind the efficacy of computer use in classrooms. So you will all be aware of the PISA trials and computers, where there is some confusion about how effective computer use is in schools. If you look at the PISA 2015 report on computer use in OECD countries, you will find that the more computer use across 50-odd European OECD countries, the more computer use you have, the worse the educational outcomes. Like, how is that possible? What's more, if you look closely, the optimum use of computers is several times a week. Not several times a lesson, several times a week. So reading that, I thought I was like on another planet. Andrea Schlechter, who is the CEO Educated Director, basically concluded that students who use computers very frequently at school do a lot worse. And the results show that in countries that had invested heavily in ICT education, show no appreciable improvement in educational outcomes. So I was thinking, oh, that's interesting. I wonder how much Australia has invested in computer technology, and you know what system my two daughters are living in. And so when you look at the OECD ranking of computer use in classrooms, I'm pleased to say that Australia is number one. We use by far the most computer time in classrooms of the whole OECD world, and that includes America. We don't have American data very available, but from collateral studies that's true. So we spend perhaps 3 times more than the Germany or Singapore, and I know because I've been to Singapore myself, and that is true. They have 5 schools which have one-to-one computers and no others. So, does that affect Australian education? Well, the NAP ICT test, as much as it is controversial, and I would know, you'd be the experts in that, certainly has shown that computer learning skills or computer skills that one needs to learn on laptops in schools have been steady, and in the last one, perhaps declining in the higher years. There's a new one coming out. We rang to try to get a forward copy of the upcoming report, but that's not available till November. So in Australia, perhaps there is some room for improvement in terms of ICT skills necessary to make sure that computer use is effective, particularly given that we are using computers 3 times more than other Western industrialized countries, and 3 times more than the tiger Asian countries who are doing really well on, well, the standard tests for what they're worth. So I looked at the data in Australia following the DR, the Kevin Rudd's BR. Have we looked at how efficacious the computer use has been in school? And I did not find much objective data. The best study probably was by Simon Crook, who has looked at 14 Catholic schools and looked at the use of computers in STEM subjects, and looked at the types of computer activities and concluded they were mostly being used to replace pen and paper, mostly word processing and e-learning content delivery and those sort of things, with very little in terms of the technology-enabled learning that we are hoping, and that some lighthouse schools do really well. So obviously some schools do really well with computers. I've been to Savannah in Georgia, I visited 2 STEM schools, and what they were doing was just amazing. They had, video making movies in corridors and science experiments in the garden and all kinds of things. So obviously computers do really well in some schools, but overall it's a very mixed bag. So unfortunately, all of these studies, including the PISA and Simon Crook and almost every other study that I know of, when asking the question how are computers used in classrooms, how do they do it? They use questionnaires. So they ask the teacher, how much do you use computers for these various tasks? And they ask the student, have you used Word in the last week? How many times? Or how many times do you use Word in a day? So this is very much, in the behavioral sciences domain, and that's why you get it. But it is not objective data, and it's very granular. So it really is ironic because Google knows what your kids are doing at school. Amazon knows. YouTube certainly knows what your kids are doing in classroom. The only people who don't know what students are doing on the laptops are the teachers. I mean, obviously you have some idea, but they don't have a overview the way that Google or the data-rich companies have. And yet the teachers are the ones who are meant to be teaching students how to use the computer effectively and for their own benefit rather than the benefit of Google and Amazon. So it's kind of a bizarre situation. So I asked myself, this was 4 years ago, what sort of data do we need? How do we collect it? And I'm pleased to say that 4 years later, we've got a philanthropic project involving 14 engineers, 28 schools and hundreds of teachers, where we have data available from students' computers. We are analyzing it and we are giving it to teachers in real time to help them, inform them for formative decisions right in the middle of the classroom. And I'll tell you more about that now. So the questions you might ask is, what affects computer learning? Well, obviously computer time. If you spend no time, you won't get any benefit. Usage type, the content should be interactive, adaptive, consumptive versus analytical. It's to do with Bloom. Role of distraction, do you need ICT skills and what kind of skills and what sort of skills and support does the teacher need? So these are the questions that we need to answer. And the answer for this is learning analytics. So learning analytics is defined as using the digital crumbs on your computer to work out and analyze and understand how your student is learning on the computer. It's not academic analytics, which all schools have, which is collating the data about what classes they take and what their outcomes are and what their racial background is and all that sort of stuff, socioeconomic status. That's kind of academic analytics. It's not classroom management systems. We don't look at the screens or bring the screens to the teacher, and it's certainly not cyber safety. This is purely analyzing the learning behavior of students on computers. Where does the learning analytics come from? Well, it was born only about 10 years ago, and it's entirely at universities. It started in universities because universities have courses online which had like 10% completion rates. So they started looking at the back end of the LMSs in universities to see, well, why are students dropping out? So they look at, well, who logs in and how often, and do they do the tests? Do they look at, do they press the help buttons and so on? But that's at university. There has been no such systems in schools, and the reason is schools are much more difficult. Schools have, the students in school do not have one single LMS that they go onto, like in a university course. They experience the full width of the internet and the computing applications. And so you really can't go onto the back end of any single LMS to look at what they're doing. You need to have an app on their computer and be looking at what they're actually doing in terms of the apps that they're using and the internet URLs that are going onto, and analyzing that. That's a very difficult task. If you've ever looked at your Chrome browser history, within an hour you've got 10,000 sort of sites that you've been to, and trying to make sense of that is very difficult. It's very dirty data. But we have had to do it, and we've done it over the last 4 years, and we put on agents onto the computer and look at all the places that the student is doing and using. So what the system looks like is that you've got a student, you've got a app on his laptop, his or her laptop. It goes up to the web. We use artificial intelligence to decide whether the activity they're doing is either educational or non-educational, with about 95% probability. We then look at the context of the lesson that the student is in. So we need to timetable, obviously. And then we decide whether the activity is on task, in which case it gets colored green. If it's off task, it's red. Or if it's an exploratory one, which is educational but not necessarily specifically what the teacher said. And those are the exciting ones, because the students are going off and are exploring the internet. And so, and they're turned blue, they're colored blue. And so we store that, and then we reflect that information down to the teacher in a live screen, so that they have the whole classroom, and with one blink of an eye they can see whether the students are on board or whether they're off task. We also, of course, have a console for the student to get their own feedback about their own behavior. And there's a little study I can show at the end which tells us about that. And also, of course, we have the big data, so we can then show we can analyze it and show de-identify it and show academics. And we also have a parental console that's coming out very shortly. So this is what it looks like for the teacher, the active live classroom. This is a classroom where you've got most of the students on task, what was assigned. You've got a couple of students exploring away, and you've got several students off task. If you...
Sorry to interrupt. Which country, what is Australia's record as far as the effective data usage is concerned?
What is the... Okay.
What is the Australian record?
Record?
Yeah, how much percent?
Oh, I'll tell you. It's coming. It's coming.
Which is the best country?
I'll tell you. I'll tell you. Thanks for the question. That's a good question. So this is a typical, a class where you've got the students. If you see this, you've probably lost the class. So you can react to this immediately. Also, you have down the bottom is a bar which is multicolored, which gives you the history through that lesson. So you don't have to keep looking at this. Our philosophy is that teachers should be able to teach face-to-face. That's the biggest value, and any software should not take them away from the face-to-face. So this is glanceable. You glance at it 2 or 3 times a lesson, that's all, and see where you're up to, where the students are up to, and identify any students who are struggling. So that's the live classroom view. You also get your kind of a worm, so to speak, of how the classroom went, so you can collate it with your lesson plan and see, what really interested the kids when where you were in the plan. For example, in the initial period, were they all on Word? Were they doing research, or did they all start, writing and collating their data, or were they, how did the whole class work and collaborate? And then, of course, you have reflective data. Inevitably, you have for the whole class, the lesson report gives you, what the on-task and off-task was for the class. There's a history of it. Down the left bottom corner, we've got distractibility index, which I'll go into a bit more. And on the right, you can see the resources. So you can, if you've assigned a whole bunch of resources, 3 or 4 URLs, or things that you wanted them to do, this will tell you how much those resources were used. And also it will give you the blue ones on the right top. So you may find that the students prefer to use a resource that you didn't actually assign, but was actually good. So you might want to adopt that and use that in the next classroom. Down the bottom right is internet use skill, search skill. So we look at the Google searches, and we analyze how well they are using the Google engine. Are they using any of the advanced features of it? Are they only stuck with Google and nothing else? And analyze that as an analysis. So I'm presenting some data from 25 schools. Year 6 to 12, 2,000 students in all. 90% of them were one-to-one PC schools, 10% were computer labs, and we analyzed a total of 110,000 lessons. 57,000 were actually using PCs, and we analyzed 25 million activities from students. January this year to date. And so the questions we asked, well, first, as this gentleman asked, very saliently, how much time is spent on a computer? Do we actually know? Do all lessons use computers? Do different subjects and year levels use computers equally? And to run, this is kind of basically framing data. It's not useful to a teacher immediately, but it gives you an idea of computer usage. 30% of all teaching time is spent on PC in classrooms. About half the lessons on the right, about half the lessons use PCs for more than 1 minute, and that's defined as a PC using lesson, and half do not use it at all. And then consequently down the bottom, of the lessons where you're actually using PC, about 70% or 80% is actually on the PC. So you have basically PC lessons, and then you have non-PC lessons, typically. And this is, you know, in 20 schools or so. And the PC usage differs by year, but not that much. It's lowest in year 7 or 8, but it's pretty similar. If you look at PC usage by subjects, there are some surprises. Now, I'm not going to have time because time is running away, so I'm not going to have time to go through all of it, but some of them are pretty obvious. Food and technology and digital media, and obviously have very high computer usage. And on the right, interestingly, things like STEM subject tends to have actually a low PC usage, which is kind of interesting. So chemistry and physics and digital technology, ironically, have quite low computer usage. Digital technology, I think, involves a lot of robot things, so they're actually hands-on things rather than computer, but that explains it. But anyway, it varies. So the question to the school, I guess, is do you know how much time is spent on computer? Do we know the optimal usage? And what quality of learning on computers, what constitutes quality and what quality do we have? Because it's an important question. Because on the bottom, on the left is how much computer time we're actually doing in Australia. The second one is how much OECD thinks we were doing from the questionnaires. And the third one and fourth one are competing countries. We can't all be right. Students are not that different around the world. So where is the optimum and who's doing the right thing and how do we get the optimum? So we've looked at our data and we've developed a model that helps us organize the data. So in the same way that teachers have the TPAC model, which probably you're all familiar with, technology, pedagogy, and content, what does the student need? Well, the student needs three things as well. He needs engagement, or she needs engagement. They need to have the right resources or access to the right resources, and they need to have ICT skills to exploit those resources. So they need those three things. So we've organized our data in those three parts in order to get some sanity. So I don't have much time on this talk, but I'll just talk about engagement because that's often kind of the most visible and most obviously a problematic area. So the questions we ask, well, how much time do they spend on the lesson task, on task, off task, how distracted are they? So in this cohort, you will be pleased to know that only about 8% of the time was spent off task. That is a very nice number, and I wish all the students would have that. So this is in schools where we have installed edQuire, told the students, told the teachers, and started using it. Unfortunately, because of ethics, we have not really been able to convince the school to install edQuire without telling the students that they're being monitored or that their performance is being measured. So that's one thing that we can do. We had some inkling from some early installations where it took us a while to install, and so we didn't announce for quite a while. And the naive number or the reference number probably is about 17%. So if students don't know that, and the teacher's not using this to correct off-taskness, it's about 17% in these schools. Now these are 20-odd independent schools, not public schools, in New South Wales, all in New South Wales. So you guys are off the hook. You can blame New South Wales. It varied between years slightly. The highest year being 10, and then in year 12 it really drops down quite a lot because they start focusing on their final exams. I guess. What's kind of off task? Well, YouTube's number one. You will not be surprised, and that's despite the fact that YouTube is blocked in some schools. Spotify, Stickman Golf for some reason must be the thing this year. There is balloons, and there's a whole bunch of games, and then there's lots of other things. So these are the kind of things that are probably not surprising to you, but not directly helpful. So the next question we ask, well, all right, so they use some time off task. How distracted is this? So we look at this, and we've combined distractibility index from the task switching and from the off task. So if a student is off task for a certain amount of time in a classroom, his distraction depends on how much that off-task was spread across the lesson and how many times they switched between on-task and off-task. That's been well proven from university studies where they actually where they texted students in lessons and got them to either answer them all at once or text them as they came. And of course, the more times you task switch, the less retention you have of the lesson and the less engaged you are. So the index on the left goes from 0 to 1, and it shows distractibility as a combination of off-task time weighted by the number of task switches. The top student, so you see there's not that much off-task, but the top student has switched 29 times during the one lesson. So that's a lot of task switching, and he's highly distractible, whereas then distraction goes down through the other students. So he's clearly a student that you might want to advise, you know what, you're spending 30% of your lesson off task. You might be better off just to spend a third of the lesson on your own task and then focus the rest of the lesson rather than being task switching all the time. So you might want to structure the lesson so that you get that out of the way. Now, do we believe that he switched 25 times? Well, we have full disclosure of their activities, and you can see that they're switching from red to green to blue to red to green many times during the lesson. So we have that sort of disclosure for each student, switching 29 times. So the distractibility index on the right in purple is moderate to high in across years from 7 to 8, and interestingly the index falls dramatically in years 11 and 12 as they come up to exams. So obviously students are able to self-govern when they have to. On the left is actually the dwell time that students spend on any one task, and the modal number is less than 1 minute. So your computer lesson typically consists of a student swapping between activities, whether they're on task or off task, every minute on average, typically. It's a very rapid, if you look at your own computer usage, there is a lot of switching and so on. So the next question is, well, what do you do about distractibility? Well, we have actual examples of teachers who have talked to us and said what they've done as a result of this data. So one teacher tried blocking. They applied the cold turkey app. I've never used it, but it's obviously something that blocks you from going on to on-task sites. And they applied it to the highly distracted students. Of course, the students installed it but didn't actually activate it. But of course, our software can tell whether they're activated or not, and so they were able to correct that. So that's one approach, which is a bit of a blunderbuss approach. The second one is co-opting distractions. So you can actually look at what kind of off-task activities they were on, and then you can try to co-opt it, see, well, if they're interested in that, let's see if we can engage them along those lines. And I'll show you an example. And then third one is self-governance. We actually did a trial where we showed the off-taskness to the students, and we're actually very pleasantly surprised. Because the students themselves don't really appreciate how much they're wasting time in lessons. And if they're shown, there is an improvement. So the co-opting distractions, this teacher noticed that the first and second line there is DC Comics. So 8 students were very busy looking a lot on DC Comics. So DC Comics in maths lesson. So he was able to restructure the class in reference to DC comic characters and capture those students. And so that's one way you can use the understanding of where your students are spending off tasks to try to re-engage them and really co-opt their interest towards engaged tasks. The student feedback, we tried in 153 students over an 8-week baseline and 8-week monitoring period. We actually gave them a console so that and encouraged them to look at it themselves. And we were able to reduce the off task from basically by half. And that lasted throughout the 8 weeks, which I was very surprised at, because I thought that they would accommodate very quickly. They'd say, yeah, whatever, and then just get back to normal. But they've actually kept it up. And we looked at logs of how often they looked, and they looked on average twice a lesson. So they looked at their own data, because we're all narcissists. We all like to see what we're doing. And so they were quite interested in looking at their own data. So that's a very promising avenue of intervention for distractibility. And the students really accepted that very well. And also it helps with the bringing students on board, so it's not like a monitoring or, we're certainly not spying. All the students know, and we show them the data. they can look at it themselves to see that it's all fair. The other avenue of use of this clearly is the outcomes analysis. So this is the kind of data that we would expect to get from this when we compare the outcomes, say the end of term exam results on the left, on the y-axis, and let's say the off-task time or the distractibility on the y-axis. Clearly, there's going to be a correlation between distractibility and outcome. So that's your line, your horizontal line going across here. This is your trend line across here. So the more off-task, clearly the outcomes are going to be lower. But looking from our preliminary data, there was going to be groups which are in the left bottom corner who are very low distractibility. They are on task, but they have poor outcomes. The intervention for those students is not to try to fix their computer behavior or be off-taskness. It is to focus on, well, do they have the skills to use the computers? Clearly those students don't have the skills. Or are they struggling with the content or with some other barrier to learning? The students on the top right corner, who do you think they are? Top right corner, highly distractible, but also high performers. So they are gifted kids, right? They've done, they're finished, they're on to the gaming. And so you can identify those kids too, because they're at risk too. Because in a term or two or a year or two, they're going to be falling down because they're going to get bored and they're going to start disengaging. So they've got just as many needs as the ones on the left bottom corner, because you want to capture them and you want to challenge them to keep them interested. So this data is useful in the real term, in real time. Those are the groups that I've identified. And these are the kind of movements you can expect from interventions in those graphs. So that's really engagement. I don't have time to go into resources because we're almost out of time. But the resources that are on task, just to give you an overview because you're probably wondering, Microsoft Word is king, number one everywhere. Google Sites for Google Docs and so on, and Zoom and Windows Explorer, they spend quite a bit of time on just organizing things on the computer, etc., etc. No surprises there. But as I said, after a class you do get a view of the resources that are the best or most used, and then you can use that information to tailor your next lesson. ICT skills is another area that we are giving teachers feedback on. So this is complex, but for example in science, we divide the activities into 21st century type divisions down the bottom. So you've got creating, co-working and so on, analyzing, processing and so on. And then each of those has 4 or 5 different categories. And then we look at what exposure do students have to these various categories of computer use. The top one is traditional teaching, where what Simon Crook found, the students are basically replacing pen and paper with computers. You can see that you've got Word, you can see that you've got an LMS, the school's LMS, and you've got some Google Docs, which is again Word. All they're doing basically is using it to replace pen and paper and books. That's the spectrum of that traditional, non-TEL teaching. The bottom line is from a student self-directed different approach to teaching, where they have a much wider spectrum of computer use, including even on the extreme left, some CAD and internet searching and so on. So we can look at the spectrum and almost create like a spectrograph of the students' computer usage, and from that infer some basic levels of skills, because participation in a computer activity carries with it some expectation of at least a basic level of skill. I mean, if you've never opened Excel, you're probably not going to be good at it. If you've spent some time on it, at least you've had some. There is a correlation between usage and competence, basic competence at least. So we are looking at that, and we are giving teachers real-time assessment of computer skills, because that's what the NAP ICT authors concluded, that students know how to use social networking, they know how to entertain themselves, but they don't necessarily have the ICT skills for learning, and they have to be taught, and you have to assess them and impugn them onto them. Bloom taxonomy, we're also looking at Bloom taxonomy, and I think in Victoria you call it something different. It's cognitive load, basically cognitive level of learning. And it varies between subjects and between teacher approaches, of course. That's another slide of the Bloom taxonomy. And then you can look at the learning profiles by different subjects as to which of the 21st century skills are being used most in the different subjects. You can't see the thing, but different subjects or different departments will have different profiles of learning, and this is real data. Some use a lot of creative activities, and others use different LMSs and CAD packages. So we can create a profile and guide teachers in that sense. So in summary, classroom computer efficacy remains inconsistent and challenging. I don't think anyone doubts that. Effective TL really needs engaged, undistracted students and the right resources and the ICT skills to use them. It needs that triad. And real-time practical classroom learning now is demonstrated, and it does provide timely, informative, practical data, hopefully, to make TL effective. Thank you very much.